This is not a podcast for comfort. It's a podcast for clarity. In a culture flooded with noise, dangerous narratives, and emotional uncertainty, this space exists to examine what actually matters and what actually works. Here we question power itself, belief systems, and the assumptions most people inherit without inspection. Most people accept instead of dissect. This podcast is about correcting that. Welcome. Bienvenue. Welcome. Marhaban. Bienvenidos to the Magnificent Ones podcast. Welcome to the Magnificent Ones. Throughout history, wars have been remembered through battlefields. They've been remembered through armies, through the generals, through the victories. We remember the defeats. History records troop movements, military campaigns, and political decisions. It remembers the dates and the changed nations and the leaders who shaped events. But history often overlooks something equally important: the consequences. Because while wars may begin on a battlefield, they rarely remain there. The consequences travel. They move through economies, they move through institutions, they move through financial markets, they move through supply chains, and eventually they move into the lives of ordinary people. The family struggling with rising costs, the entrepreneur delaying expansion, the retiree watching purchasing power decline, the worker wondering why opportunities suddenly seem harder to find. The truth is, the greatest cost of war is often not paid by those who fight it. It is paid by societies forced to absorb its consequences. Today's tensions continue to rise in various parts of the world, particularly throughout the Middle East. Many people are focused on the military dimension of the events, and that is understandable. But I believe there is another discussion that deserves equal attention. The discussion is about systems, a discussion about economics, a discussion about consequences, because if there is one lesson that leadership teaches us, it is this: events matter. Consequences matter more. The question is not simply what happens during a conflict. The question is what happens after. What happens when uncertainty spreads? What happens when the markets react? What happens when businesses hesitate? What happens when nations begin protecting their interests? What happens when stability begins to erode? To answer those questions, we must first understand something many people take for granted. Prosperity is fragile. Most people assume prosperity is normal. They assume grocery stores will remain stocked. They assume fuel will remain available. They assume businesses will continue expanding. They assume markets will continue functioning. They assume opportunity will continue growing. And yet, for most of human history, prosperity was the exception, not the rule. Prosperity is not the natural condition of mankind. It is the result of stability. It is the result of trust. It is the result of predictable systems functioning effectively over long periods of time. People invest because they believe tomorrow will arrive. Businesses expand because they believe demand will exist. Workers build careers because they believe institutions will remain stable. Everything depends upon confidence. Everything depends upon predictability. Everything depends upon stability. Civilization is not built upon wealth. Wealth is built upon civilization. And when stability begins to crack, the consequences spread rapidly. This brings us to one of the greatest misconceptions of modern society: the illusion of distance. Many people hear about conflicts occurring thousands of miles away, and they assume they have little relevance to their daily lives. That assumption may have been more reasonable a century ago. It is no longer reasonable today. The modern world is interconnected in ways previous generations could scarcely imagine. Energy flows across the ocean, raw materials across continents, manufacturing spans dozens of countries, financial markets operate 24 hours a day, supply chains stretch the globe. The phone in your pocket may contain components sourced from multiple continents. The food on your table may depend upon fertilizer produced thousands of miles away. The vehicle you drive depend on global networks of productions, transportation, and commerce. We do not live in isolated economies. We live within a singular interconnected system. In a connected world, there are no distant wars, only delayed consequences. And those consequences often arrive through the same doorway: energy. Energy remains one of the foundational pillars of modern civilization. Not because we drive cars, because everything requires energy. Food production requires energy. Manufacturing requires energy. Transportation requires energy. Shipping requires energy. Construction requires energy. The modern economy runs on energy in the same way the human body runs on oxygen. Most people never think about it because energy functions quietly in the background until something disrupts it. When instability enters energy markets, costs begin to rise. When costs begin rising, transportation becomes more expensive. Once transportation becomes more expensive, products become more expensive. When products become more expensive, inflation begins to spread. Notice how quickly the chain develops. A conflict begins, market reacts, costs increase. Consumers feel the pressure. The battlefield may be overseas. The invoice arrives at home. This is where many discussions about war become incomplete. People focus on the event, they ignore the reaction. Yet history rarely moves through isolated events. History moves through chains of consequences. Conflicts create uncertainty. Uncertainty affects markets. Markets affect investment. Investment affects growth. Growth affects employment. Employment affects families. Everything is connected. This is what I call the cascade effect. A single disruption creates secondary effects. Those secondary effects create tertiary effects. Eventually, consequences become larger than the original event itself. We have seen this repeated throughout history. The lesson remains consistent. The system matter, and systems are often more fragile than they appear. This becomes even more important when discussing major powers. Much attention is often given to military strength, missiles, aircraft carriers, armies. These are important, but they are not the only forms of power. Modern power is increasingly economic. Modern power is increasingly technological. Modern power is increasingly financial. Nations possess influences not only through force, but through leverage, control over resource, control over production, control over logistics, control over technology, control over capital. The strongest nations do not merely possess weapons, they possess leverage. This is why global markets pay close attention to countries such as Russia and China. Not because conflict is inevitable, but because capital matters. Russia remains influential through commodities, agriculture, energy, and strategic resources. China remains influential through manufacturing, industrial capacity, logistics, and supply chain integration. Neither reality requires speculation. Neither reality requires prediction. They are simply facts of the modern economic system. The question is not what any nation will do. The question is how interconnected the system has become. And perhaps nowhere is that interconnection more visible than in the American economy. Many people fail to appreciate the role the United States plays within the global demand. The United States is not the world, but it remains one of the most important economic engines. American consumers purchase enormous quantities of goods and services produced across the globe. American investment influences global markets. American consumptions drive demand throughout countless industries. When the American economy grows, many nations benefit. When the American economy slows, many nations feel the pressure. This is why recessions rarely remain local. When one of the largest engines in the global economy begin to stall, every connected system feels the vibration. Trade slows, investment slows, growth slows, confidence weakens. This effect spreads, and eventually they arrive where they always arrive, at the human level. Because beneath every economic statistic is a person, a family, a dream, a goal, a business, an opportunity. The cost of war is often paid by those who never hear a gunshot. It is paid by families struggling with inflation. It is paid by entrepreneurs facing uncertainty. It is paid by workers facing layoff. It is paid by retirees living on fixed incomes. It is paid by young people entering uncertain labor markets. This is the cost few discussions acknowledge. The human cost beyond the battlefield, the economic cost beyond the headlines, the societal cost behind politics, which brings us to the leadership lesson. The purpose of understanding risk is not to fear. The purpose is preparation. Leaders must resist the temptation to become emotional observers of events. Instead, they must become students of systems. They must understand incentives. They must understand consequences. They must understand second order effects. Most people focus on what is happening. Leaders focus on what happens next. Preparation is not panic. Preparation is wisdom. Resilience is not pessimism. Resilience is responsibility. The objective is not to predict the future. The objective is to become strong enough to navigate multiple futures. History teaches us that uncertainty is inevitable, conflict is inevitable, change is inevitable, but collapse is not inevitable. Adaptation remains possible, preparation remains possible, leadership remains possible, and perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Wars may begin with force, but societies endure through resilience. History remembers battles, societies remember consequences, and leaders who thrive during uncertainty are rarely the ones who successfully predict the future. They're the ones who prepared for it. Thank you for joining me for another episode of The Magnificent Ones. Until next time, continue learning, continue growing, continue building a life worthy of the responsibility entrusted to you. If this podcast challenged you, good. Clarity often does. The point here isn't consensus or reassurance. It's to leave you more precise than when you arrived. Keep what sharpens your thinking. Discard the rest. But don't confuse familiarity with truth. If this conversation mattered, follow the podcast and share it selectively with people who value depth and not noise. Until next time, stay disciplined with your thinking, selective with your attention, and honest about what you're really optimizing for.